Well, it's another Friday, and we're excited to be talking about something that's relevant to a lot of us and important to those who have a business and have either decided to sell it or, on the other hand, maybe deciding to buy it. So today we're going to be talking about the things that really make a business sellable and what a company has to do to prepare for that. So with that, Ed, I'm going to let you kind of kick it off based on some of your experience, and then we'll just go on from there.
Well, thank you, Ray. I'd like to start off by saying that when you own a family business, it's not a liquid asset. You can't run down to the bank and get your money the next day. To really sell a business, you're looking at 9 to 12 months. That's a long time. People don't realize that. People expect to sell their business quickly, and it doesn't work that way. And the other thing related to that is it costs 10 to 15% of whatever you're going to make off the business normally to sell that business. Because it's not liquid, you got to prepare it for sale. You got to find potential buyers. It's a long, involved process and it costs money and you need outside help. So that's the first point. And another point related to that is very few business owners have any idea what their business is worth. And I think that's a first start in this whole process. And it's based upon future cash flows of whatever company you're running. So the better your profit margins are and the more cash you're throwing off, the higher the valuation of the business. Which gets into the next point. How do you improve that valuation once you know what it is? And that's where you get into some type of optimization plan where you talk about our 8 drivers we've talked about in the past, how to drive more profits and cash flow to the bottom line. But in particular, I think, and this is one of the things I'm going to pass along to John on, and that is the difficulty of navigating a family business when you have several shareholders that are related at different ages. They have different objectives, and hopefully they're getting along and well enough to continue running the business. And so, John, I'd like to throw it over to you at this point in time, and you can tell us a little bit about some of your experiences on how difficult that process is.
Well, it is difficult. We all know that. And, business itself is difficult, but you get the family involved, it becomes, a whole nother layer on things. And it becomes a much more social issue in the business. And you have to have some of those psychological, sociological skills there so that you can start to understand where the family is from all different points of view. I think one of the first challenges that you have in these family businesses when you're not the family is that the family themselves are blind to a lot of things. One of them is they have this sort of ignorance to their entitlement. Maybe that's the way to say it, that they don't understand that certain employees in the building really don't like the fact there's family members involved. And therefore, there's this stress within the business of family members having some power or some authority, some management. They have some obvious, responsibilities. Then real employees see their responsibilities cross over. They have those challenges where they won't do something because they know a family member is involved, or that's a family member's decision, or they will then get frustrated with the family for not making decisions. So you have these tides in the business that are pretty complicated, and until you take steps backwards and say, hey, what's really going on, it's really hard for a family to see it because they typically have grown up in this business. They're unawares of what might be happening on the other side of the wall, that sort of internal struggle that the floor gives you and so forth. So, that's the first big part, that when you are invested into the business long enough to see these things, it becomes apparent. And I know all of us have been on sort of boards, or we've been consultants to some family businesses. You see it at a distance, but until you really get in the day-to-day, you don't really know that a lot of these things are very caustic, very bad. And you have these very talented individuals in the business that are being pushed back by some maybe untalented people, or they're just ignorantly stepping over their good employees. I don't know how other way to say that. So that's one of the biggest challenges. And then you kind of go to what Ed said, how do we build value with that? the first thing is you have to understand that these tides within the business are happening. How do you address them? How do you formalize them? How do you bring management in that's going to allow real management of a business so that you can drive some profits, that you can kind of change what's going on? And it takes a long time.
So I'd kind of like to explore that just a little bit more, John. The whole idea that families may not understand the differences. Well, and to bring what John Mills has brought into, they don't have the experience to understand that there's a difference between their functions. One of them being a business owner, and another one maybe perhaps being part of the team, an employee, and they can't separate the idea of from employee and owner. And they
I'd
really
like to say that
they ought to be very distinctly different. Go ahead.
right. There's a confusion of their positional authority as an employee of the company versus ownership authority. And I would say that one of the worst examples of this is when a minority owner, threatens to fire somebody or deal with them or have them. I mean, this is, very, very negative and very out of line and should never be allowed to happen, but yet it does. Somebody's a 5% owner and they've got no position in the company, but yet they will show up and act like they own the place. Well, they kind of do, but they don't run it. And you've got to step aside and let the employees run it.
That is really true. And when the larger, I guess if the stock is more diluted and there's more owners in that group, some people don't know that some people have no authority, and they just assume that they have the last name, but the last name doesn't have any stock sitting behind it, and they therefore don't have any authority. And then it becomes a real pissing match at times, that you're just like, well, this person over here is telling me, delegating, doing something. They find out later they didn't have any authority, and so then the employees feels pretty hurt about that, because now they have somebody who is overlording on them when they're not really in that position of power within the management structure.
So, John, I think you had an exact example on that recently, and I think you're talking about a situation where you've got a younger employee, maybe not 22, maybe 25, 20, or 30, who comes in and knows very little about the business, but because they happen to be a son, daughter, et cetera, of one of the other owners, it's assumed that they have authority, when in fact they're plebes. They have no authority. They're just trying to learn the job. Yet, because they got the right last name, other people assume that they have more. Does that sum it up?
Yeah, I'd say it. Even if that person coming in knowingly is trying to do their best, and they might even be skilled in that position, they might have gone off and had some experience, came back. The traditional, or I guess the non-family employees, really they think it stinks. There's no way around it. Even if they don't, even if that ownership employee, I guess, or sibling comes in, the rest of the group just doesn't understand that dynamic within the office, so to speak, that sort of office management ownership group, and therefore it always is a conflict. And then that individual tend to stretch what is allowable, from showing up on time to
right.
extra breaks to thinking vacations are just part of the job. That then becomes a HR challenge across the rest of the team by saying, this person is about equal to you in the management structure, but they're off doing whatever they want and not finishing projects and not getting things done. It becomes a really hard problem. You then take that to ownership, who is in the position of the final authority, and they shake their head. They're just like, well, that kid's been doing it since they were in diapers. But
that's where you've
problem.
got a weak management structure, though, John. I've got a case in point study, a three generational company out of the Midwest, $12 million, where the son of the founder tried to come in his 20s and wasn't prepared to listen to the founder, left for 12 years, became very successful in his own right, doing his own marketing and work, and came back in his 30s and said, okay, I'm ready to listen and come along. And the company then flourished under the new leadership because he had brought new things with him. About 5 years later, his son, who was then in the 20s, came in because he wanted to get involved and started working in the docks and working loading and offloading. Well, one night they come in and he's invited all his mates to have beers on the lock, 4:30. Well, the end result was that is HR came in and put him on probation and then gave him a month's notice to get the heck out. And the employees, of which there are about 120, realized that the son with the same name didn't have any more authority or right than they did. And
Right.
the company worked extremely well. But you had to be tough. In fact, I would say that if you're in a family business, typically the family members who don't have any real authority and are working there need to be treated actually with precision, and they need to be treated a little harshly even. You're not, just because you've got the family name doesn't mean to say you can park wherever you want and have long lunches.
Yeah. The only time I've ever seen this work is a single client that I've had for a long time, where the third generation was coming in after they had two of the four children had come in, and after they had had experience working elsewhere, basically said, yes, I've got a commitment. I'd like to come in and do this. So how did they treat it? They made sure that everybody in the company realized that these two children were coming in to learn about the business, and they were on the bottom rung, and that the people who were where they had to go in every single department and work in every department for 6 months, a year. It was a 5-year program to teach them the business. And so everybody realized that they could tell them what to do, that their job is to teach them their job. Now, they knew that they weren't going to compete with them because they're going to be moving up the ladder if they're successful. But everybody also knew if they can't muster at this level, they're not going to make it up the ladder. So there's some sort of expectations that they're going to have to fulfill. So that did two things. Three. That took a little bit of the sassiness away from the male, who felt like, yeah, he's an owner, he's going to be running this thing someday, because he was out there, humping on the truck just like everybody else, and he began to realize it, getting up really early in the morning and all the rest, what his employees had to do, and that gave him in turn the appreciation of what his employees were doing, having been through that. And then one of the other main things was that by the time they got through this battering, if you will, everybody respected them for having been in their departments. And so it took a while, but when they were finally ready to take up, not senior, but junior management positions, they had earned some of that trust. And it's not as though there weren't issues when they finally took over completely. People had to realize, and they had to fire a few people and some of that kind of stuff too. But for the most part, that particular plan worked. That's a very disciplined approach. Not every business can do that.
I would say that's the exception rather than the rule.
Yes, absolutely. Yeah.
I was going to say, Ray, Ed, I think, came up with the linchpin, though, possibly, and that companies work on compensation. And at some point, if your compensation program is not factual and accurate and honest to the work that's done, then you're going to get up with owners wanting more or less than they're getting, or feeling like they need a return even though they're not working. I would argue, and Ed, perhaps if you could address this, is if the people who are working in the company are fairly compensated for whatever their work job is, and then you end up with a legitimate dividend, and the dividend is divided based on ownership, then that should reduce the complications.
You hit it right on the head there, John, and that's the way it has to work. I mean, people get compensated for what value they bring to the company. Ownership gets rewarded through dividends. But the problem is it's
based
really
on their
hard.
ownership percentage. Yeah.
It's really hard to get ownership that's intermingled with the day-to-day operation to understand this. So unfortunately, a lot of times they get the compensation, they get a certain fixed amount of money for doing nothing. And that takes away from the value of the company, and it shows favoritism with the other employees. It's not a good way of running a company. So you're right. You have to separate the compensation based upon performance, and the ownership shares in the dividends. And that's the way it should run.
You know, and I was going to add another dimension that can be really challenging. I have an experience in which, you know, a son came into the business, and we had a very clear drug policy, but the owner chose to ignore it when it came to her son, and it set an exceptionally bad precedent for the company.
Right.
You know, and I'm sure you've all seen that. You know, that was, you know, the prince is here, so he can do what he wants.
So it wasn't beer out on the loading dock. It was a little bit of weed or something, huh?
Whatever. I can, you know.
Well, I think you know, I had happened to work with a company recently. There was a distributor that we were producing for, and they went through a change. The father was selling to the sons, and they made a really clean break. And what they did was they moved that location. They kind of used that as a way to get a little bit more east, to get a little less costs on rent and land. They changed the name slightly, so it went from name A to name B. The sons are still in the business. The father's leaving, but I knew he had a larger family. So therefore, you know, they got the equity out that the father deserved. He now has that equity in a personal kind of, you know, place. He can distribute that how he wants to all the kids. And then the kids that are with the business have created a new business. And they forcefully changed it. Everybody kind of noticed it. And we made a few calls, and yeah, they were changing bank accounts and all that. So they kind of almost did an asset sale there, where now the two sons are still there. They have the majority of that value in the business, but they did pay off the father in a way that seemed really fair from the outside. I don't know the details of the inside, but kind of following Ed's plan, that you have to just make these clean business breaks, these clean business decisions that then allow that wealth to be created and then passed on in a way that probably is more fair to the larger family than just the two sons that were involved.
I
Well, the
ran
other
across
thing,
another situation where the first generation built this really successful company, and then they owned the real estate. So they're passing along the company to the second generation, but they're not passing it along very quickly. So the second generation is working their tails off, trying to grow the business, and the guys at the top, the first generation, are reaping all the rewards and are inhibiting the further transition of the company to the next generation. So you run across all kinds of situations when you're dealing with family businesses.
Boy, and I suppose with people living so long now, you know, you could have your great grandchildren in your business if you're old enough. You know, in the olden days, when everybody died when there's 40, 50, 60, you didn't have this kind of multi-generational problem. So, and John, you had some concepts about family type, what the structure of the family is. I think that was probably interesting, and people listening to this would probably identify with one versus another. What were some of those different types that you've identified?
Me?
Yeah.
Well, I was just thinking John Mills. Well, you know, I think you
yeah.
end up with different, you do end up with different, I guess, you know, pieces that come into the puzzle, and it could be, you know, father, son, or mother, daughter, however that might be, versus, you know, siblings. I think siblings are a different thing than that mentorship or authority pushing down on a son or daughter saying, hey, this is the way we do it, you know, like it or not, or fail at it. Like Ray and Ed probably have some examples of how people fail at not having those authorities placed on them. But I think the bigger challenge is the sibling challenge, because now you have a bunch of kids that grew up at the dinner table in different orders in their birth order, and they have different needs, wants, they have different skill sets. They're not all mirrors of their parents, they're all fractions of their parents, and so therefore they bring some of the best and worst attributes, and when they clash, man, it could be worse than anything else. So those end up being the biggest challenge. And I was thinking, just, I don't know why I thought about it, but we know that a couple of our clients over time have been like 50-50 partners, and that's a challenge in itself, but it's also a blessing because now you have to have both of them agree. versus these fractional partnerships where 25% or 30%, or they're all a little bit different power structure in there. And then the age is part of it too. So now that you have some real conflicts there, and you take a step back, and you wouldn't wish that on anybody. But you put your foot into a situation that's really happening, and you have to go make it work better. It probably is going to be more heartache than fruitfulness in that, because they're just going to keep stumbling over things. They're going to take a little bit here and take a little bit there. They're starving the company to some extent, and then you accidentally throw in that third generation, wherever that comes from, and now you go, wow, that's a really challenging situation. But you're right, there are different segments of all family businesses, and it probably in almost all cases didn't start out correctly, where you set it up with a buy-sell agreement, with some shares, with some dividend expectations, with that understanding of salary versus the dividends. To John's point about, you made your salary based on what you provided the company, and in your case, you're at the docks and your brother happens to be the CEO. I mean, there's a difference there in salary demands. Does the family accept that and understand it? I don't know. In most cases, I'm going to say no, because they're sitting around the table mad that one person got the lollipop and they didn't, because they didn't finish the corn.
Yeah, and I think one of the other things that we haven't discussed that you bring to mind, John, is that many times families, and I've seen this in a lot of clients over the years. Many times the father figure, could be the mother as well, but whoever is running the business, many times they see issues with their children, and they think that they can help their children out by letting them work in the business. And so it's not so much that they see them as owners, or that they are built to run the company, as much as it is, Jack needs a job, and so let's just give him a job over here for a while. Put him in the warehouse. So now you've got the problem we already talked about, where Jack's got the wrong last name. He throws his weight around a little bit, but really you're only helping him out. Maybe you hope for a few months and he stays for years. So you have these. So families have to be careful not to use ownership of a company as a way to solve individual children, grandchildren problems. That just doesn't work. Business is so hard. You have to put your people in position based on their merits. And if you don't clearly look at the merits of your family, you're going to end up with a problem somewhere.
This can be referred to as
how it lives. Yeah, go ahead. Sorry.
This can be referred to as the Santa Claus syndrome.
Yeah, okay.
I think each of us had a company we've been involved heavily. I had a company that was a family company that grew to several locations, and a couple of family members involved. But the patriarch of the family, who was high energy and very driving, used the money that was coming in to literally compensate whoever he felt was going to be the most in need, not based on any particular merit that they had brought to the company. And the dynamics of the company ended up with a severe breakdown in communication between a couple of family members, one of them disappearing, and the company itself struggled and failed to go forward because the personal family dynamics became really entrenched with the management of the company, and the employees were sitting there basically going, this is really a circus, because at the end of the day, it was all about Santa Claus giving out cookies to his favorite few. Yeah. And everybody else was supposed to be making the money so that he could do it. It was like, and it was very, very obvious that it was a problem, but it would be called a systemic family issue. And I'd say that if you are a family that's in business, some substantive counseling is needed to get down to a compensation package based on merit. Yeah. And then an expectation of, if the company is going to be sold, how do the dividends get put together. We haven't talked about one thing though, and that quite often in small businesses, the real asset of the business turns out to be the real estate of the business. And so that ends up, over years being major. We had a company that was in the $100 million area that we're working with, that we're going to diversify and go into another country and do some development. And it was a third generation company, and it successfully made the leaps through this and was very, very successful in its industry. It was a niche industry. And they had brought in were large enough to have HR directors, CFOs, in-house legal counsel. So they had done this really well. And they were going over to invest in another country. And the return on investment for this other country was like 4 or 5%. And it wasn't acceptable to them. So the current president said, no, we're just not going to do it. There was a couple of us who were consulting with them, doing some due diligence, and the individual involved had a very good grip on his business. But what he had overlooked was there was over 200 or 300 acres of built out and finished property that he had inherited from the generations. And they were being paid out on a flat monthly lease to the family trust. But by the time it was all said and done, it was about, 10% of what that should have been. So their profitability here in the US was particularly high because really they weren't paying very much for the company land. Now, they didn't care because they were the company land and they got the money. But by the time we unwrapped all the numbers, and it was all legally tax-wise and appropriate, everything was above board, except when they realized that actually, they were renting the house for $2 a month and it should have been $2,000. They then realized that the return on investment for their overseas opportunity was actually very good.
Yeah.
But they were a company that had professional consultants, and they had professional employees who were franchised to do their job, and they got compensated for doing their job.
That's why most businesses, they separate the real estate from the business. And you usually put the real estate in an LLC, and the business is usually an S Corp. And everything should be at fair market value. Otherwise, what you're doing is exactly something you have to guard against, showing profitability of one over the other. You want to know which each one is making separately. And the only way to do that is based upon separation and fair market value treatment.
Right.
Well, I think that goes to the point you made earlier, that most of these companies, particularly when we're talking about small family businesses, really don't understand what the value of the business is. And when it comes to them departing, it becomes a serious problem because they don't know what it's worth.
Absolutely, and that's where you really need to start. You have to have an understanding of what it's worth, and you also have to have some type of vision of what it could be. Or you keep it the way it is, and eventually you sell it at a depressed price. But that is very important, and that is based upon cash flow analysis. John and I spent quite a bit of time analyzing that, and the bottom line was this. So at one point in time, a company was doing very well, and its cash flow was very robust, and it had a really good valuation. But over time, the profitability evaporated. And the ownership still thinks it's worth a lot of money. And we have to go through the exercise of what kind of cash flow are you bringing in? Negative cash flow. How can you have negative cash flow in the future to generate a positive valuation now?
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, that is clearly the challenge. And then I think kind of just even to expand on John's idea about land, but the assets within the company, the hard assets, the machinery, all of that stuff, they spent $1 million to get that in, and it's probably worth 100,000. And so there's a depreciation to all those hard assets. They see it making the same amount of revenue every day, and so they think of it as an asset that keeps producing. But if somebody else looks at it, they're going to see it as a depressed asset that is at the end of its life. And yes, it has some revenue possibilities there, but does that asset to your point, is it on the books correctly? Is it normalized? Same as land, is the rent of the building, the land value normalized to what market value is, and does the ownership actually own that in a way that, or understand that in a way that they can accept it as being, well, this is an old piece of machinery. We just kept it making, it's a cash cow. Other people will not see that cash cow in the same light.
Yeah, they think they
Yeah.
have to replace it next year, and that's an interesting a discussion for another time. But that's an interesting observation on the balance sheet, is that you've got assets of land that are undervalued on the balance sheet, and then you may have other assets, because it's really worth a lot more. You may have assets on the books that are equipment and is worth a lot less, or vice versa. And so you get used to the balance sheet thing, which has depreciation, which is a fake number in a regard. It used to be real, but it's really kind of a fake number now. It's a tax issue. So we can discuss that at another time. But let me say before we close up, Ray, that we've done 4 other series just on small family business. And so below, we will have links for all of those other 4. So if you'd like to go through that series and sort of recap with this one, then the links will be there for you. So, and don't forget to like and subscribe to our channel. Right.
Yeah, thank you, Ron, for that kind of closing. I think it's important. Obviously, there's a lot more that we can discuss on this. I'd like to suggest that we try to do that again maybe next week and explore it in more detail. I want to thank everybody again. Hey, this was a good session. Appreciate everybody's input.
Thank you. We'll see you.
Well, thanks, guys. Nice to see you.